The chamber had no windows. That was the first thing you noticed about the Sovereign Compact's Grand Convocation Hall, the deliberate absence of sky. Every other assembly room humanity had ever sat in, on any world, had at least one pane of transparency, one view outward, some architectural acknowledgement that the universe continued past the walls. Not here. The Compact had built their most important room as a sealed vault, and I had spent enough years in alien politics to understand the message. What happens inside this room is the whole world. Nothing outside matters until we say it does. I had been sitting in that room for 11 days. 11 days of what the Compact called preliminary deliberation, which meant 11 days of speeches from bloc representatives who had already made up their minds, procedural motions filed to run out the human delegation's patience, and the occasional direct insult wrapped in formal language, so dense it took my translation earpiece 3 seconds to parse. They were very good at insults, centuries of practice. The Dreth Bloc's senior representative had on 3 separate occasions referred to Earth's diplomatic standing with a phrase that my earpiece rendered as provisional custodianship of observed space, which sounds almost neutral until you understand that in Dreth political taxonomy, it was the same category used for civilizations not yet capable of self-governance. I had let each usage pass without remark. I noted each one in my session log with timestamp and the exact Dreth phrasing, because there would come a time when the exact phrasing mattered, and it was not this time. My name is Adira Voss, Senior Envoy Sol Diplomatic Corps, second posting to the Compact in 12 years. I had been to the Grand Convocation Hall twice before, once to observe a tributary negotiation with the HFY cluster, once to deliver a routine trade attestation. Both times I had left with the sense of having passed through the digestive system of something very large and very patient. The Compact did not negotiate. The Compact consumed, processed, and expelled, and everything it expelled was smaller than it had been on the way in. They had not counted on us understanding that. The day the declaration was read, the hall held 412 delegates from 31 member species. I know that number precisely because I counted them. Old habit. You count the room before anything happens, because rooms have weight, and the weight tells you something. 412. Every seat filled. Viewing galleries packed to the back rail. I had never seen the hall at full attendance before. Neither had most of the delegates. From what I could tell, by the way they kept looking at each other, checking the galleries, adjusting their ceremonial collars. The hall at full attendance was a statement. The Compact wanted witnesses. They wanted the gallery full because what they were about to do was meant to be seen being done, the way a public execution is meant to be seen. Not because the outcome requires witnesses, but because the spectacle is part of the point. Even the Compact's own members found the full attendance unusual. A Preln delegate 2 rows behind our table leaned toward her colleague and said, something too low for my translation earpiece to catch. Her colleague made a short gesture that in Preln body language indicates discomfort with procedural irregularity. I noted that too. The convocation chair was a Vareth elder named Sarasome. She had held the chair position for longer than my career, which at that point was 22 years. She was the color of old pewter and moved the way very old, very powerful things move, slowly, without wasted effort, with the absolute confidence of something that is never once needed to hurry. She arrived at the central dais 7 minutes after the session opening bell, which was also irregular. Chairs arrived before the bell. Traditionally, the 7-minute delay was not an oversight, it was staging. It gave the full hall time to understand that this session was different before the difference was named. She read the declaration herself. That was unusual too. Normally, the chair delegated formal readings to a lesser officer. The fact that Sarasome stood at the central dais and read it in her own voice was a message, and the message was, we are doing this ourselves because we want you to understand that every word is intentional. It was a long document. 53 clauses, each one meticulously worded. I had a copy in my hand before she finished the first paragraph. Our intelligence division had obtained a draft 2 weeks prior, which told me the Compact had not been entirely careful about compartmentalizing the decision. I read along silently while Sarasome read aloud, checking our version against hers. There were 4 minor differences, all of them in the preamble, all of them making the language slightly more severe than the draft had been. Someone had pushed for harder phrasing at the last moment. I noted that. It would matter later. The declaration had 3 operative sections. The first formally rescinded Earth's Compact observer status, the limited diplomatic standing we had held for 9 years. The second declared a state of hostilities between the Sovereign Compact and the Sol system, effective immediately upon the chair's signature. The third called on all compact member species to refuse port, supply, and navigational assistance to any vessel registered to the Sol system, and to detain any Sol Diplomatic Corps personnel found in compact space. Within 30 standard days of the declaration's filing. 30 days. They had given us 30 days to get our people out. I set my copy down on the table very carefully. Across from me, the compact's lead negotiator, a Dreth male named Counselor Varishkal, whom I had spent 9 of the 11 days arguing procedural motions with, watched me set the document down. His species had 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal band, which made it difficult to catch where exactly he was looking. I had learned, in 9 days, that when his outer 2 eyes angled toward each other, he was paying very close attention to something. All 4 were forward-facing now. He was watching my hands. I folded my hands on the table. The hall had gone quiet the way halls do when everyone is waiting for someone to break. The declaration ran to its final clause, and Sarazom's voice settled into silence, and 412 delegates waited. My second officer, a man named Padir Oland, was seated to my left. He was younger than me by a decade, technically more senior in the Corps' rank structure, as of the previous year, and had been assigned to this posting, as what my director had called, diplomatically, a steadying presence. What my director had meant was, Oland would stop me from saying something irreversible. I had a history, in my director's estimation, of saying things that were technically true, but operationally premature. Oland said nothing. He was watching me the way Varishkel was watching me. Everyone was watching me. I let the silence run. 30 seconds, which in a room that size felt much longer. The ventilation system made a low continuous sound, almost below hearing. Somewhere in the upper gallery, something rustled, a delicate shifting weight, fabric moving. Otherwise, the room held. 30 seconds is not a long time by any objective measure, but in a sealed chamber with 400 witnesses waiting for a reaction, it is long enough to communicate something. What it communicated was that I had heard the declaration in full, had processed it, and had found nothing in it that required me to hurry. Then I said, "We know." That was all. 2 words. I said them at a normal conversational volume, not raised for the room, so that only the delegates in the nearest arc could have heard them directly. The translation systems would carry it. I let the systems do the work. Varishkel's outer eyes pulled apart, processing, not focusing. I had come to recognize that as confusion. I did not elaborate. I gathered my documents, stacked them the way I would stack documents at the end of any ordinary working session, aligned the edges, and set them to my right. Oland, reading me correctly, began gathering his own materials. The 2 junior attachés at the far end of our table did the same without being told. It was a practiced quality of movement, not choreographed, just practiced in the way any professional team develops shared timing. We had worked together for long enough. Sarazom spoke from the dais. Her translator rendered it in my earpiece. Envoy Voss. The declaration requires a formal response from the Sol delegation. Protocol demands acknowledgement. You have it, I said, still not looking up from the documents. The compact requires a substantive response. The nature of Sol's intended compliance, or non-compliance, with the terms. I looked up then. I looked at Sarazom directly, across the length of the hall, and I said, "The compact has its answer. I have nothing to add." Then I stood up. There is a particular quality to standing up in a room full of people who expected you to remain seated. I had used it before, twice, in my first posting, and it never stopped being effective. The body's geometry changes. You are no longer at their level. You are in motion, which means you are no longer subject to the room's rules. Standing up in a formal proceeding is a declaration of intent without the words, and it carries additional weight in a room where the custom is to remain seated until recognized. I had not been recognized. I was not asking to be. Oland stood up 3 seconds after I did. The attaché followed. 4 humans in a room with 412 aliens, standing up and beginning to organize their materials as if the session had reached its natural end. Varishkel spoke. His translator gave me, "Envoy, this session has not been adjourned. The chair has not recognized the conclusion of." "I'm aware," I said. I picked up my document case. "We'll be leaving now." We walked out, not quickly. That was the important part. We did not rush. We did not look back. We moved at the pace of people who have completed their business and have somewhere else to be. I could feel the hall behind us, the weight of 412 bodies watching 4 humans cross a marble floor toward the exit corridor. The distance was not short. It took perhaps 40 seconds at our pace. 40 seconds of absolute silence from the full attendance of the sovereign. Compact's grand convocation. No one called after us. No ceremonial guard moved to intercept. The gallery watchers, who had come to see a spectacle, watched a different kind of spectacle than they had planned on. 4 people walking calmly out of a room that had just declared war on their world. The corridor outside was staffed by 2 compact ceremonial guards, very tall, in the charcoal and copper regalia of the chair's household. They stepped aside. Whether they had orders to do so, or whether they simply did not have orders to stop us, I neither knew nor cared. We walked through. Olin said nothing until we were 3 corridor segments away, and the hall's entrance was out of sight. Then he said, 2 words. Yes, I said. He thought about that for a moment. Will it be enough? It already is, I said. He didn't ask me to explain. Oland was good at not asking me to explain things when the explanation would arrive by itself within a short time. The transit station was a 20-minute walk from the convocation complex, through a series of official corridors and a climate-controlled bridge that connected the government district to the port quarter. We walked it in the same unhurried manner we had crossed the hall. 2 of the attachés, young, trained, keeping pace, had not said a word since they stood up at the table. Good instincts. This was not a moment for conversation. At the first junction, a compact administrative aide intercepted us, young Prelin, carrying a sealed courier tube. She said something in Preln that my earpiece rendered as a formal request for a response brief from the Seoul delegation. I told her, politely, that the Seoul delegation had already provided its response, and that any additional communication from the compact should be directed through the conflict mediation provision of the sovereign response doctrine, which she should find indexed under the compact's treaty code administrative registry, section 9, subsection 4. Then I walked around her. At the second junction, a dressed bureaucratic officer was waiting, older, more senior, holding a physical document, and looking like he had been sent at speed from somewhere important. He addressed me by title and requested clarification of the delegation's intentions with respect to the 30-day departure requirement under the Declaration's 3rd operative clause. I stopped for this one. He deserved a clear answer, and the answer was useful for me to deliver in a corridor before anyone had had time to process what was happening back in the hall. The Seoul delegation is departing compact space under the Declaration's 30-day provision, I said. We have no issue with the timeline. Please note for the record that we are departing voluntarily, in compliance with the Declaration's terms, and not under constraint. He wrote something on the document he was holding, and the delegation's formal response to the Declaration has been given, I said. In the hall, 2 words recorded in the session log. That is the delegation's complete formal response. He looked at what he had written. He looked at me. He looked back at what he had written. I left him in the corridor. We boarded the transit vessel 40 minutes after leaving the hall. The vessel was an administrative shuttle, not diplomatic grade, which had been a deliberate choice when we booked it 11 days earlier. A diplomatic grade vessel came with compact monitoring equipment embedded in the communication systems. An administrative shuttle came with the standard package which our technical team had addressed before departure from Seoul. The vessel was ours in the ways that mattered. Olin sealed the main cabin as soon as the dock umbilical cleared. He turned to look at me in the particular way he had been not looking at me for the past 2 hours, the look that said, "Now, in private, with the door shut, you can tell me what that was," I told him. Not everything. There were elements of the margin posture that were not mine to share, even with my own second officer, but enough. The intelligence assessment, the 4-month window, the legal architecture of the sovereign response doctrine, the prepositioned assets, what the authorization line in my contact report would trigger. I kept it factual. Oland listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of him, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The declaration was the trigger." "Yes," I said, "we couldn't have moved without it. Not legally, not in a way that holds." He considered that. And if they'd chosen a different mechanism, economic isolation, navigational restriction, the quiet version, then we'd have had a different problem, I said. We'd prepared contingencies. But the declaration was the cleanest path. We wanted them to declare. We prepared for the possibility that they would, I said. We didn't manufacture it. The faction inside the Inner Security Council that preferred direct force had its own reasons. We read those reasons correctly and built accordingly. If they had decided differently, the margin posture would still have had value, just different value. He absorbed that. There was a particular quality to Olin's silences. They were not empty, they were processing time. And when he spoke again, the thing he said was always the thing he had been working toward, not a filler thought. "The 30-day window," he said finally. "In the declaration, they gave us 30 days to get our people out." "Yes," I said. "They thought they were being generous. They thought they were being orderly," I said. "The 30 days was for them, not for us." It gave them a clean transition window, soulful personnel exiting, compact posture shifting, no ambiguous overlap period where an incident could complicate the legal status. They wanted a bright line. We just used it. He looked at me for a moment. How long have you been running this in your head? It was not exactly a question. I answered it anyway. Since the second year of the posting, I said. When the HFY vote ratified and I understood the pattern well enough to see where it ran. He was quiet again. The drive systems came to life beneath us, a low vibration. The vessel beginning to clear the dock, and the cabin's internal gravity adjusted slightly. 41 months, he said, yes. And you never. He stopped, reformulated. The 11 days in that hall. 3 times a day Var Ishkel filed procedural motions that he knew we knew were time-wasting. Sarasome read 3 citations from the old compliance framework to our faces on day 7 that were legally inapplicable and she knew it. Yes. I said, you never gave them anything. No. He nodded, that was all. He understood what it meant to sit in a room for 11 days and give nothing. Not because you had nothing to give, but because what you were waiting for required the room to keep moving at its own pace until the moment arrived. He had sat in that room with me for 11 days and said almost nothing himself, which had required the same quality of patience and had gone entirely without acknowledgement until now. You did well in there, I said. The 11 days, I mean that. He looked slightly surprised, not at the content but at the timing, I think. I was not in the habit of saying that kind of thing in the middle of an operation. But the operation was no longer in the middle. It was in a new phase now, and the new phase permitted some acknowledgments that the previous phase had not. What I had not said in the hall, what I would not say to Oland for another 4 hours, after I had filed the required contact report, was the rest of what I meant by, we know. The compact had assumed the phrase was diplomatic bluster. They had assumed I meant, we know you've declared war, and we know what that means for us, and we are registering our awareness before retreating to discuss terms. That was what every prior civilization at that table had meant when cornered. The phrase was, in the compact's experience, the first sentence of a capitulation, the opening of a process that ended with the declaring party, setting the terms and the declared party accepting them at some negotiated discount off the worst case. I had meant something else entirely. What I had meant was, we knew you were going to do this, we have known for 4 months, and we have been using those 4 months very carefully. This requires some background, and I ask the reader's patience with it, because the background is where the story actually lives. Sol's position in the compact's political order had never been comfortable. We had come to compact space not as a client civilization, not begging for inclusion, not presenting ourselves as a market or a labor pool or a source of raw materials, but as what we were, an independent species with our own territorial claims, our own military capability, and our own opinion of the compact's governance structure, which was largely unfavorable. We had accepted observer status 9 years prior, not because we needed the compact but because observer status gave us access to the navigational network, which cut transit times across the relevant sectors by about 40%, and because it gave our diplomatic corps a legitimate reason to be in compact assembly rooms, watching. We had been watching for 9 years. What we had watched was a systematic pattern of what the compact called integration. Integration was the word the compact used for the process by which a non-member civilization's resources, territorial claims, and institutional structures were gradually absorbed into the compact's framework, leaving the civilization nominally intact but functionally dependent. It was elegant as coercions went. You were never occupied. You were simply made unviable without the compact's support. Your trade routes rerouted through their networks. Your technological development dependencies cultivated. Your political class offered enough individual benefit to prefer accommodation. By the time a civilization understood what had happened, the integration was usually complete enough that reversing it meant accepting a period of genuine hardship, which most political classes were unwilling to do. We had watched them do it to the HFY, the Prelin Collective, the Torvasi Confederacy, and 4 smaller groups I will not name here. The HFY had been the most striking case, a civilization with significantly more raw military capacity than Earth's at the time of their observer entry, brought to full client status in 16 years without a single declared war. 16 years of procedural friction, navigational dependency, and incremental institutional capture, and then the HFY Assembly had ratified full membership terms in a vote that was technically voluntary and practically inevitable. We had studied the pattern with the care it deserved. The question was not whether the compact would attempt integration with Sol. The question was which mechanism they would choose. Integration by economic dependency seemed most likely. We were useful, and useful things are easier to domesticate than to destroy. But our intelligence division had flagged, 18 months before the declaration, a shift in internal compact deliberation that suggested the calculus had changed. The faction within the compact that preferred military leverage had been gaining ground. There had been several catalyst events, a human freighter captain who had refused a compact customs inspection and been supported by our government. In doing so, a territorial dispute in the Karev margin that we had resolved in our own favor without consulting the compact's arbitration body, and something else, a quiet census of Sol's military assets that the compact's intelligence service had conducted approximately 2 years prior and, apparently found reassuring. Their census had been conducted on our civilian registered vessels and our declared military strength. We had not corrected their assessment. I want to be precise about this. We did not hide anything from the compact census. Everything they looked at was real. The ships they counted were real ships. The weapon systems they cataloged were real weapons systems. The strategic posture they assessed was genuinely our assessed strategic posture at the time. What we did not do, what no one had asked us to do, was flag the assets that were not covered by the census's methodology. The census counted declared military vessels and registered defensive platforms. It did not count the shipyards. It did not count what the shipyards had been producing for 40 months under a domestic infrastructure program that was never publicized outside certain levels of our government. It did not count the 14 pre-positioning depots we had placed inside the Karev margin under navigational rights we technically held, but had never made the subject of a formal notification to compact administrative services. Did not account the waffles that were, at the moment the declaration was read, in the Grand Convocation Hall, sitting in positions along the compact's primary resupply corridor in states of complete sensor silence, running cold, emitting nothing, waiting. The compact had counted what was visible. We had been quiet about the rest. This was not deception in the legal sense under compact framework. Under compact law, a non-member observer civilization was required to disclose treaty-bound assets and formal military alignments. Vessels in quiet pre-positioning under existing navigational rights were not required disclosures under the relevant code sections. Our legal division had spent 4 months confirming this in detail, because the last thing we could afford was a legal ambiguity that the compact could exploit after the fact. The confirmation had come back clean. We were within the law at every step. We had simply read that law more carefully than the compact expected us to, and planned around what it permitted, rather than around what the Compact assumed we would choose to do. The 4 months between our intelligence division's assessment that a declaration was likely, and the declaration itself had not been spent in panic, or in diplomatic maneuvering to prevent the declaration. They had been spent in preparation for it, specifically, in moving assets to positions that the declaration's invocation of the sovereign response doctrine would authorize us to operate from. The sovereign response doctrine. This is the piece that matters, so I will explain it carefully. The compact had signed and loudly publicized, as evidence of its commitment to conflict governance, a framework called the sovereign response doctrine. The doctrine granted any party subject to a compact war declaration the legal right to take defensive military action within compact space for purposes of protecting its own navigation, personnel, and territorial integrity. The sovereign response doctrine had been written by the compact's own legal scholars in the compact's own assembly to govern conflict with civilizations the compact expected to be fighting from a position of weakness. It was designed as a safety valve, a way to prevent declared wars from collapsing into genocides that would embarrass the compact's institutional record. Was generous because the compact's legal scholars had never imagined a scenario in which the declared party would want generous language. They assumed the declared party would always be weaker and would use the doctrine's protections to sue for minimal terms. What the doctrine meant in practice, for a party that was not weaker, was this. The moment the declaration was signed and filed, Sol had legal authorization to conduct active military operations in compact space in ways we had not technically had the right to conduct before. Observer status came with constraints on military activity in compact adjacent sectors. The declaration removed those constraints. It was the compact that removed them by declaring war. We simply used what the removal provided. The declaration was the key. Everything else was already in place, waiting for it. We had needed the declaration. 4 months of preparation had been predicated on receiving it. If the compact had found another mechanism, economic isolation, gradual navigational restriction, the kind of quiet institutional capture they had used on the Hesari. We would have had to find a different approach, but our intelligence division had assessed the declaration as the most likely path, the faction within the Compact's inner security council that preferred clean force, having sufficient bloc support to push it through, and our preparation had been built accordingly. When I said, "We know," in that hall, this is what I meant. We knew the declaration was coming. We knew what it would authorize. We knew where our assets were. We knew what the next 72 hours would look like. I filed the contact report from the transit vessel 6 hours after the walkout. It was a short report. I gave the time and date of the declaration's reading, confirmed that the document matched our pre-obtained draft with 4 noted variances, recorded the exact phrasing of the preamble changes for the legal division's review, and appended a single line. Threshold reached. Authorization confirmed. That line went to 3 addressees: my director in the Seoul Diplomatic Corps, the commander of Seoul Fleet Operations, and a sealed office at the center of our government that had no public name but had been running, for 41 months, the project we internally called the Margin Posture. I did not receive acknowledgement from any of the 3 for 11 hours. That was the longest 11 hours of my career. Oland and I sat in the transit vessel's small conference room and did not discuss what was happening, because there was nothing useful to say about it, and because the transit vessel's conference room had no windows either, and because some silences are cleaner than conversation. We played 3 rounds of a strategy game that neither of us was very good at, and that I won. Not because I was playing well, but because Oland was playing worse than usual, which told me something about where his attention was. He did not say anything about his attention. I'd not ask. The acknowledgement, when it came, was also short. My director wrote, "Received, safe transit, well done." The commander of Seoul Fleet Operations did not write to me at all, which I took as the appropriate non-response from a flag officer with considerably more pressing things to do than write to an envoy in transit. The sealed office sent 2 words. Clock, running. Within 3 hours of the declaration's filing in the Compact's formal record system, which was the moment the document achieved full legal force, under Compact Treaty Code, the 12 vessels in the Karev margin broke censor silence. They did not attack anything. They did not fire a weapon. They announced their presence on all standard Compact navigational frequencies, broadcasting SOL registration codes and a formal legal notice under the Sovereign Response Doctrine, citing the declaration's file number and timestamp, notifying all Compact registered vessels in the corridor that the approaches to 14 specific coordinates were now under SOL navigational authority, pending resolution of the declared hostilities. The notice was filed through the Compact's own navigational registry system. We used their filing infrastructure. We paid the standard administrative fee. I found that detail particularly satisfying later. In the same 3-hour window, the 14 depots activated. Each one had been staffed, fueled, and operationally ready since the completion of the 41st month of the Margin Posture. Each one began processing the pre-positioned assets that had been sitting in them for varying periods. The longest stationed equipment had been in place for 14 months. By the time Compact Fleet Command had processed the initial announcements from the 12 corridor vessels and begun generating response options, were 40 additional SOL vessels actively operating in areas the Compact had not previously known we occupied. 40 vessels that had not been there yesterday, by the Compact's understanding, and had in fact been there for between 2 weeks and 14 months, depending on the specific asset. 40 vessels. In addition to the 12. In addition to our declared strength. The Compact's first military response was a fleet order to 3 of its own patrol vessels in the Karev margin, directing them to investigate the announced SOL presence. The patrol vessels moved to investigate. What they found, at the first of the 14 coordinates, was a fully operational depot facility, staffed, lit, with SOL navigational markers on all relevant frequencies, and a formal legal notice posted on every communication band. The Compact's patrol doctrine required them to monitor. The patrol commander filed a report. The report took 6 hours to reach Compact Fleet Command, because the Compact's internal communication routing in the Karev margin ran through relay nodes that, it turned out, 2 of our newly active depot facilities sat adjacent to. The route had been, in a technical sense, slightly lengthened. I learned this detail later, from a contact in Compact Fleet Command who told me about it with the specific kind of exhausted disbelief that comes from discovering that a sequence of events you thought was simple was actually a sequence of events someone had planned around in detail, months in advance, and had said nothing about. The compact's internal response to the depot announcements was, according to the same contact, complicated by a procedural problem the compact had not anticipated. The Sovereign Response Doctrine's navigational notification system, through which we had filed our presence announcements, routed through the compact's own administrative registry. The compact could not delete our notices from their own system without formally invalidating the treaty mechanism that governed them, which would have voided other notices currently active, including several that protected compact military assets in disputed sectors. Their legal staff spent a day and a half working through this problem and arrived at the answer that there was no clean procedural solution. The notices stood. The patrol commander, whose report had taken 6 hours to arrive, filed a second report at 48 hours after the depot activations. That was significantly longer than his first. It documented each of the 14 depot facilities, their stated capabilities, their legal notices, and his assessment of their operational significance. It also documented something he had noticed that had not been in his first report, because he had needed time to verify it. The depots were not improvised. The construction quality, the infrastructure integration, the supply inventory visible from external sensor sweeps. None of it looked like a rapid emergency deployment. It looked like facilities that had been built and maintained and staffed for an extended period before the declaration. Which of course it was. The patrol commander appended a question to his second report. He asked, in formal language, whether compact intelligence had known about these facilities prior to the declaration. He asked the question politely. He asked it only once, but he asked it, and it went into the record, and several members of the Inner Security Council read it and had a difficult day because of it. I did not know about the patrol commander's second report until later. At the time, 600 light minutes from the compact's core systems, on a transit vessel, whose drive was building toward cruising speed, I knew only that the first phase of the margin posture was running. I could not see the depots activating. I could not see the 12 vessels in the corridor filing their navigational notices. I could not see the compact fleet command response rooms or the Inner Security Council convening. I knew these things were happening because we had built them to happen when the authorization line was sent, and the authorization line had been sent, and the people who had built the margin posture were not people who built things that did not function. But I could not see them. I was in transit, in a vessel with no surveillance reach into compact space, with the drive hum and the flat overhead light of the cabin and Oland at the opposite console reading a technical document he had read twice before, using the reading, the way I had used the strategy game, as something to do with the hands while the rest of the mind was elsewhere. The 11 hours before the acknowledgement arrived were what they were. I will not make them more dramatic than they were. I sat in the conference room and I thought carefully about everything I had done and everything I had not done and whether there were gaps I should have identified and hadn't. The honest assessment was that there might be. Operations of that scale always had that possibility. What I had was not certainty. What I had was thorough preparation and the knowledge that the people responsible for execution were the people we had chosen for this task for specific reasons. That was enough for action. It was not enough to eliminate the uncertainty entirely, and I did not pretend to myself that it was. The 12 vessels in the corridor had been commanded by officers I had met twice during the preparation phase, once in a planning session, once in a separate briefing that I had attended in a different capacity. Both times they had impressed me as the kind of officer who could hold a cold position for 14 months and maintain readiness without losing sharpness. That was not a common capability. It was the capability the assignment required, and we had selected for it. Those officers knew how to be patient. They had proved it. The acknowledgement came at 11 hours and 20 minutes. My director's message was the first to arrive, the others following within minutes. And then the shipyards. The compact census had not counted the shipyards because the shipyards were in the SOL system and the census had not been permitted to inspect domestic industrial facilities. Our government had declined the inspection politely, citing domestic industrial confidentiality regulations, which was an entirely standard declination under Compact Observer Code. The Compact's intelligence service had made a note and moved on, presumably estimating our production capacity from our declared fleet size using standard extrapolation models. Those models, for a civilization of our technological level, would have predicted a construction rate of perhaps 3 to 4 capital vessels per year. The actual rate for the previous 3 years had been higher. I will not give exact figures here, because the declassification process on the margin posture has not yet completed as of my writing this account. What I can say is that when Sol Fleet Operations filed its first formal order of battle disclosure under the Sovereign Response Doctrine, which required us to disclose our engaged military strength within 48 hours of the doctrine's invocation, the Compact's response to that disclosure, as reported to me later by a contact in Compact Fleet Command, was 3 hours of complete institutional silence, followed by an emergency convening of the Compact's Inner Security Council, which had not met in full session in 11 years. 3 hours of silence is a long time for an institution that runs on process. I thought about Sarasome sitting at the head of whatever room they convened in, reading the disclosure figures with the particular quality of stillness I would later come to associate with her. That recalculating stillness that I had seen on the relay signal and had recognized immediately, having watched something like it in smaller rooms on smaller stakes many times before. I thought about Var Ishkel in that room, 4 eyes tracking, outer lenses pulling together in his concentration expression. I thought about the Prelm delegate who had made the discomfort gesture in the gallery, and wondered whether she had gone to the Inner Security Council convening, and whether anyone in that room had remembered that she had made that gesture earlier. Before the reading had finished, the disclosure was not filed aggressively, it was filed accurately. Those are different things, and the distinction was important to us. Sarasome contacted me personally 4 days after the walkout. I was still in transit. Sol was a long way from the Compact's core systems, but the communication was routed through the corridor vessels, which were now serving, among other functions, as Sol relay points. Her image came through with a distinctive slight delay of a relay-carried signal, and I noticed, before she said anything, that she had chosen to make the contact from what appeared to be a personal office, rather than from a formal chamber setting. That choice said something. She looked different from the Sarasome, who had read the declaration from the dais. The quality of her stillness had changed. Before, her stillness was the stillness of a predator at rest, contained potential, deliberate economy, the patience of something that has never been in a hurry because it has never had to be. Now her stillness was a different kind. I had seen that quality in rooms before, in people before, on both sides of many tables. It was the stillness of something recalculating, not panicking. The Compact's chair did not panic. That was one of the things that made her effective and formidable and worth taking seriously. But recalculating, envoy Voss, she said. Her translator had a slight lag on the relay signal. Counselor Chair, I said. The Compact requests clarification on several aspects of your fleet's order of battle disclosure. The disclosure is complete and accurate, I said. There is nothing to clarify. A pause. On the relay signal, I could not tell whether it was transmission delay or deliberate. With Sarasome, I assumed deliberate until proven otherwise. The Compact wishes to open dialogue on the current situation. That would require the restoration of Sol observer status, I said, which the declaration rescinded. As a non-observer, non-member entity in a declared hostility with the Compact, we are not in a position to conduct informal dialogue through standard channels. If the Compact wishes to communicate with us, the appropriate mechanism is the Sovereign Response Doctrine's conflict mediation provision. Another pause, longer this time. The mediation provision requires acknowledgement of the declaration's validity. Yes, I said. She waited. I knew what she was waiting for. She was waiting for me to find a problem with that condition, to refuse to acknowledge the declaration's validity as a bargaining position, to create procedural ambiguity around the document's legal standing. That was what a civilization trying to negotiate from weakness would do. Deny the hostile act's validity. By time, the Compact had seen this maneuver from every civilization it had ever declared against, and they had legal responses to it prepared. We did not need to buy time. The Sol Diplomatic Corps acknowledges the declaration in full, I said. We acknowledge its date, its content, its signatories, and its legal force under Compact Treaty Code. We are prepared to engage conflict mediation at a time of mutual convenience. Sarasome was quiet for long enough that I checked whether the relay signal had dropped. Then, you acknowledge it. Completely, I said. I watched her process this. Her outer facial membranes, something between skin and exoskeleton, the Varith's characteristic structure, shifted in a pattern I associated with concentrated thought. She was working through something, and the working through was visible in a way that her face was not usually visible. Sarasome was a practitioner of opacity. Watching her work something through openly was its own kind of information. What she was working through, I suspected, was this. They had signed the declaration expecting Sol to dispute it, litigate it, seek emergency adjudication through the Compact's legal apparatus, and thereby spend 6 to 12 months in procedural paralysis. while the compact positioned its own military assets and turned the economic isolation clauses into practical reality. Seoul's refusal to dispute the declaration's validity removed all of that runway. By acknowledging the declaration fully and immediately, we had collapsed the procedural timeline to zero. There was no litigation phase, no adjudication window, no ambiguity about legal standing. The declaration was valid. The sovereign response doctrine applied. Everything we had done in the 72 hours since the reading was authorized. The compact's plan had assumed we would fight the paperwork. We had used the paperwork instead. "What are your terms for mediation?" she asked. "We'll have something to you within the week," I said. She waited again, perhaps expecting me to preview the terms, to give her something to start working with. I did not preview them. The terms were not yet final. 9 days of work remained on them, and there was no advantage in previewing a partial draft. "Is there anything else?" I asked. There was not, apparently. The signal ended. I sat for a while after the contact closed. The transit vessel's conference room was quiet, and the relay terminal screen had gone dark, and the low-frequency hum of the drive systems was the only sound. I found I did not feel the way I had expected to feel at that moment. Not triumphant. Not relieved, exactly, though relief was somewhere in it. There was something quieter than either of those things. A specific kind of tiredness that comes at the end of something you have been building toward for a very long time, and it arrives not as elation but as the sudden absence of a weight. Olin was in the doorway. "How did she sound?" he asked. "Careful," I said. He nodded once. He understood what that meant. The mediation terms took 9 days to draft, because we spent those 9 days not drafting them so much as making certain each one was precisely correct. Every word mattered. Every clause carried consequence. We were not trying to humiliate the compact. Humiliation is unstable. It seeds the next conflict inside the resolution of the current one, and we would be dealing with the compact for the foreseeable future, and a settlement that left the compact feeling publicly diminished was a settlement that would be relitigated the moment circumstances changed. We were trying to arrive at an arrangement that the compact could accept without institutional catastrophe, and that Seoul could live with operationally, which is not the same thing as the arrangement the compact would have preferred, but which was reachable. The core of what we proposed was this: the declaration would be formally suspended, not rescinded. Suspended meant it remained on the compact's legal record as having been issued. We did not ask them to erase it, which would have been an admission that it had been an error, and therefore a question of institutional accountability that no governing body manages gracefully. Suspended meant it was in abeyance, pending the resolution of the conditions that had led to it, which was diplomatic language for, "We are choosing not to prosecute this conflict further at this time." Seoul's observer status would be restored, but under revised terms that replaced several of the compliance expectations the compact had built into the original observer framework, with language that acknowledged Seoul's independent military standing and territorial rights in the Karev margin explicitly. The 14 depots would remain ours under a registered territorial notification, which the compact's navigational authority was, under the Sovereign Response Doctrine's settlement provisions, required to acknowledge. We also asked for something unusual, something that was not about military positioning or territorial rights or navigational access, or any of the operational elements of the settlement. We asked for the record. Specifically, we asked that the declaration, its suspension, and the summary of the events between those two documents be entered in full into the compact's public historical archive, accessible to any observer civilization or member species that requested it, not buried in a restricted administrative annex with a 50-year seal, not summarized in language approved by compact communications staff. In the public record, unredacted, where anyone considering whether to trust the compact's institutional mythology could read exactly what had happened here. Sarasome objected to this more strenuously than to anything else in the proposal. I had expected that, because I understood what the archive request was and what it was not. It was not a punitive measure. It was an informational one. The compact's power was partly mythological, the myth of its inevitability, of the futility of resistance, of the pattern that had run from the Hesari, through the Prelm, through the Torvasi, without variation. A public record of a declaration that had been suspended because the declared party turned out to have a significantly larger prepared military capacity than the compact had known, and had used the declaration itself as the legal trigger for an operation that the compact's own sovereign response doctrine authorized. That was not a myth-sustaining document. That was a document that said, the pattern has an exception, and the exception is documented, and it is available to anyone who wants to read it. The compact had spent centuries curating its record to produce a mythology. We had asked for one entry in that record that told a different kind of story. She called me twice about the archive clause. Both calls were civil, careful, technically sophisticated. Sarah Zohm was very good at her work and was not someone who let frustration degrade the quality of her advocacy. She proposed alternatives: a restricted access filing available only to full member species, a joint summary with agreed language reviewed by both parties, a sealed annex with a 20-year review date, after which the question of public access would be reconsidered. Each alternative was a different shape of the same thing, a way of blurring what had happened, of making it harder for a civilization sitting in an observer chair 9 years into its own gradual integration to find this record and understand what it documented. Each time I said no. On the second call she said, "You understand the archive entry will be read by every civilization, considering observer status." "Yes," I said. "You understand what it will tell them?" "I do," I said. "That's why we want it there." The silence on the relay was long enough to have meaning. "Envoy Voss," she said finally. "Was this always the plan? From observer entry?" I thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was complex, and the complex answer was not mine to give unilaterally. It touched on things that were still classified, decisions made before my posting, frameworks established by people who had more strategic oversight than I did. 9 years of observer status had served multiple purposes, some of them evolving over time, some of them present from the beginning. I was not in a position to give Sarah Zohm a complete account, and even if I had been, this was not the right moment for it. The answer I gave was not dishonest. It was precise. "We came to compact space as what we are," I said. "We have always been what we are. If the compact census had been more thorough, none of this would have been a surprise." She was quiet. "Then you waited for the declaration." I didn't answer. "You needed it to be legal," she said. "It was not quite a question. The compact gave us observer status under a framework that limited our right to operate militarily in compact space," I said. "We honored that limitation throughout the observer period. The declaration removed it. We operated legally at every step under compact treaty code. You positioned your assets before the declaration. Under navigational rights we held and disclosed at observer entry," I said. "We disclosed those rights. Compact Administrative Review chose not to flag them as strategically significant. That was the compact's assessment, not ours." Another long pause, long enough that the relay static filled the line with a texture of its own. "We underestimated you," she said finally. "I know," I said. That was the whole conversation. After she ended the contact, I remained at the relay terminal for some time, and the drive hum was low and constant, and I thought about what had just been said and what had not been said, and the space between those two things. The mediation agreement was signed 44 days after the declaration. The archive entry was filed the same day, in full, under the compact's public record classification, accessible without restriction. I read it that evening on a personal terminal in a government housing unit outside the capital, one of those anonymous temporary residences that diplomatic staff use between postings. The entry was accurate, complete. It said what had happened without softening or elaboration, the way a good legal document says what it says. In the weeks following the signing, I received several communications from people I had not heard from in years. Former colleagues, retired Corps officers. One retired compact administrative delegate who had left the compact service 2 years before the declaration and whom I had met once at a maritime treaty conference. Their messages varied in tone and length, but shared a common thread. They had read the archive entry, and they had something to say about it. Most of what they had to say was between the lines. They said things like, "Interesting outcome," and "The archive record is thorough," and I imagine the process was complicated. The diplomatic register of people who understand what they are reading and choose not to say so directly, which is its own form of communication. The compact's member species reacted to the archive entry's public filing in different ways, and I heard about several of those reactions through the kind of back channel that develops around any significant institutional event. The Preln delegation, that same delegate I had noticed making the discomfort gesture in the gallery, issued a formal request through their block representative asking for a procedural review of the observer entry requirements. The request was filed under a routine administrative heading and did not generate immediate public attention, but our analysis office flagged it as potentially significant. We were right about that. The procedural review, which took 14 months, resulted in modifications to the observer framework that were less comprehensive than what we had negotiated. but were in the same direction. The archive entry had done its work without anyone needing to cite it directly. The HFY cluster's response was quieter and, to my mind, more interesting. No formal communications, no procedural filings. What the HFY did, in the 3 months following the archive filing, was send a trade delegation to the Kreft margin. Not a diplomatic delegation, a trade delegation, technically in compact space, technically operating under their compact membership terms, but operating in a sector where Sol Navigational Authority was now registered, and the 14 depots were active. The delegation used 2 of our depots for refueling and resupply. They paid the standard fees. They filed the correct notices. They stayed within every applicable legal framework. What they were doing, in that careful legal way, was establishing a usage pattern, a record of Sol infrastructure in the Karav margin being used by a compact member species for routine commercial transit under terms that were transparent and reciprocal. It was a quiet way of saying, this is normal. This infrastructure exists and it is used normally. And it was a quiet way of establishing, in the navigational and commercial records of the Karav margin, that the corridor's character had changed. I did not speak with anyone from the HFY delegation. I did not need to. They knew how to build a record. They had been watching compact space for a long time. I have read the archive entry several times since. Each reading is slightly different. Not because the document changes, but because my distance from the events changes. And distance alters which parts of a document are foreground and which are background. I was asked, in the years that followed, by a range of people, colleagues, journalists with appropriate clearance, one historian writing an institutional account of the margin posture, whether I had felt something specific when the settlement was complete. Some of those people, asking that question, wanted to hear about triumph, the satisfaction of the outcome, the vindication of 9 years of watching from assembly rooms, the particular pleasure of having been right about something for a long time, having it finally become visible. That is a reasonable thing to want to hear. It produces a clean narrative with a satisfying shape. What I actually felt was more specific and less clean. What I felt, reading the archive entry and knowing it was now in the compact's public record, accessible to any observer civilization sitting 9 years into its own gradual integration and wondering whether the pattern could be interrupted. What I felt was something like the satisfaction of a thing being accurately described. Not celebrated, not mourned, accurately described. There is a particular value in a record that does not obscure. You can argue about what it means. You cannot argue about what it says. The archive entry said, here is what happened. Here is what was in place. Here is what the legal framework provided. Here is the timeline. Anyone who reads this entry now knows that the pattern which the compact had presented as inevitable had run against a party that had spent 9 years reading the pattern carefully and had decided to be prepared for a different outcome. That seemed right to me, not as an act of aggression against the compact, which was still a complex and powerful body that we would be working with for decades, but as a contribution to the informational environment of the civilizations that would come to compact space after us, and sit in observer chairs after us, and read the compact's record and form their own assessments. We had not hidden our preparedness for dramatic effect. We had not saved the order of battle disclosure for a moment of theatrical revelation. We had filed it on the required timeline, accurately, and the accuracy had been sufficient. The drama was in the numbers, not in how we presented them. The Karav margin depots operated under Sol Navigational Authority for 8 years following the settlement. During that period, they were used extensively by 3 non-compact civilizations who found our registered presence in the corridor useful for their own transit calculations. The corridor was faster for them with our facilities available than without, and we made them available under transparent terms. One of those civilizations was the HFY, which surprised me, and then, on reflection, did not. The HFY had been watching compact space for a long time. They knew the corridor mattered. They had been in it before, when the compact's certification of the route was the only way through, and they understood what it meant to have an alternative. I stayed in the diplomatic corps for 11 more years after the declaration. 2 more postings to compact assemblies, different chambers, different delegates, but the same institutional culture, with the same learned pattern of taking up as much space as possible and testing what could be taken. I handled those postings differently than I had handled the first ones, because I was a different envoy and the context was different. But some things about the approach remained constant. I counted rooms before sessions. I logged every procedural insult with timestamp and exact phrasing. I let silences run, a tribunal proceeding as a fact witness, which I will not describe here, because the details remain partially restricted. A long final assignment to the Joint Treaty Commission that produced a navigational framework covering 22 corridor sectors and took 4 years to negotiate, involving 14 delegations and 2 mediating bodies and more subcommittee sessions than I can accurately recall. The compact was present at that commission. So was Saul. We worked across the table from each other, which required a quality of professional steadiness that did not happen automatically. It had to be maintained consciously, session by session, because the history between the 2 delegations was present in every room, even when it was not spoken about. Var Ishkel was there. He had been promoted to commission delegate, which, in the compact structure, was a significant posting given to individuals, the inner security. Council considered both capable and reliable. We worked together on several technical subcommittees over the 4 years, and he was what I had come to expect from him. Careful, precise, methodical in his preparation, and economical with words in a way that I respected because it matched my own preference. We did not discuss the declaration period directly during the commission. There was no need to, and no advantage in it. What needed to be discussed was what was in front of us, and we discussed that. He paid careful attention to everything I said. In Dreth professional culture, attention of that quality is a form of respect. Not displayed, not performed, but functional. He listened to me the way you listen to us whose analysis you have found to be accurate in conditions that mattered, and you want to continue finding out whether the accuracy holds. On the last day of the commission, when the framework had been signed and the session formally closed and the hall was moving into the particular relaxed disorder of a concluded proceeding, he caught me in the corridor outside the signing room. He said nothing for a moment. His outer eyes tracked together. That motion I had learned years ago meant concentrated focus. He had something he wanted to say, and he was considering the precision of it. He said, "You knew in that room." "Yes," I said. "Before the chair finished reading, before she started." I said. He considered that. "Then, I watched your hands when you set the document down. They were steady." "They were steady," I agreed. He was quiet for another moment. The corridor was busy around us, delegates and staff moving past, the acoustic texture of a concluded proceeding, and he seemed unaware of it in the way that focused people are unaware of background noise. "I would have been afraid," he said. "I was afraid," I said. "Fear and steadiness aren't mutually exclusive." He looked at me with that 4-eye horizontal focus, and whatever he was processing, he gave it the full time it required. "What were you afraid of?" he asked. I thought about that question because it deserved a careful answer rather than a reflexive one. The honest answer was specific, and it was the same thing that had been true in the Grand Convocation Hall, in the transit vessel conference room, in the relay room during the calls with Sarasome, in the 9 days of drafting the settlement terms. The thing I had been afraid of, from the moment our intelligence division flagged the likely declaration, was not the declaration. It was the gap between what we had prepared for and what we had not prepared for. Any operation of that complexity had edges, where the planning stopped and the improvisation began. I had spent 41 months knowing exactly where those edges were and being unable to fully know what lay beyond them. That something would go wrong in a way we hadn't modeled, I said. That there was a variable we'd missed, and it would show up at the wrong moment. He absorbed that, the outer eyes tracked apart, processing complete. "Nothing did," he said. "No," I said. "Nothing did." He inclined his head in the formal Dreth acknowledgement. Not quite respect, not quite deference, but something in the register between them. Something that carried a weight the words did not. Then he turned and walked toward the transport bay, and I did not see him again. I retired from the Corps 3 years after the commission framework was filed. My director held a small dinner. 8 people in a dining room in a government building. Food that was better than government food usually is. There were no speeches which I had requested. My director said something brief about 25 years of service and the particular quality of difficult postings and the institutional value of people who understood that the most important moves in a room were not always the loudest ones. Everyone drank something. Dinner ended. People went home. The ordinary texture of an ending. I took a transport to the coast the following morning. The coast was a long way from anything that had been in the political news for 25 years. I rented a small house with windows that faced the water. Windows specifically. I wanted windows, and spent several weeks doing very little except reading things I had not had time to read during my career. Walking the tide line in the early morning when the light was still flat and the beach was empty, and sleeping in a way I had not slept in a long time. One evening I read the Compact's public archive entry again, from the beginning. I read it, the way I had read documents my whole career, carefully, checking each clause against what I remembered of the events, noting where the language had the slightly worked quality of text that had been negotiated, rather than drafted freely. The archive entry was still accurate. It still said what had happened. Someone coming to it fresh, without context, would learn. Here is a war declaration. Here is what the declared party had prepared. Here is the legal framework that permitted the response. Here is the settlement. And anyone who came to that entry as an observer civilizations, sitting in an assembly room of the Sovereign Compact, watching the procedural insults accumulate and the navigational dependencies tighten and the pattern begin to take its familiar shape, would also learn something else. They would learn that the pattern was not inevitable, that it could be read, that a civilization that read it carefully and prepared for it patiently enough and waited for the correct legal threshold had been able to produce a different outcome. That seemed to me worth the 9 days of arguing over the archive clause. Outside the window, the water was moving in the particular way water moves at dusk, the light going flat on it, the small waves catching less brightness, the surface becoming a different texture than it had been at noon. I watched it for a long time. The archive entry was on the table beside me, and the coast outside was loud with wind and quiet with distance, and I thought about a sealed room with no windows, 412 delegates watching 4 people walk unhurriedly across a marble floor, and 2 words said at conversational volume to translation systems in an empty space. We had known, and the knowledge had been patient enough to wait for the threshold. And the preparation had been sufficient when the threshold arrived, and the composure had held across 11 days, and a walkout and a relay call and 44 days of settlement work, and when it was over the record said clearly and completely what it said. I set the archive entry down on the table beside the window. The water kept moving. That seemed right.